And for all the reasons I was just saying, Trump is promising in the sense that he can break things, he's a circuit breaker, as Seymour Hersh put it. That's the same reason that he's feared and despised by so many people who had control of the Republican Party and want to remake it.
So recently, Glenn Greenwald was asked some of his top priorities in life as far as issues that he sees developing in the American political situation. And if you followed Glenn for a long time, you might know what his answer would be. I won't spoil that. But in this clip, he gets into a little bit of what it means to truly divide the Republican Party and what that means for the future, what the current divisions are, and why the left does not understand that very well. So let's take a look and let's react.
Well, one of the priorities that I have always had, not just as a journalist, but previously as a lawyer, and I think anybody who watches the show, including tonight, sees this, is the cause of ensuring that people can speak freely without punishment by the state or by other institutions. Because everything I was just talking about, the freedom to dismantle your own ideas and reconstruct them, to subject your own presuppositions to critical scrutiny, to have open discussions with people who have different views than you, to ensure that propaganda from power centers can be challenged and questioned. None of that is possible. None of it. Unless there is the right of free speech and free discourse aggressively preserved. And obviously there were, as I said in that interview, policies of the Biden administration that I found beyond what had previously been done in the United States, at least for decades, on the censorship front, in terms of the systems and programs to coerce big tech to censor the dissent of American citizens on a wide range of issues, including COVID. The idea of just controlling the internet or censoring the internet in general is extremely disturbing to me. And obviously these steps promised by the Trump campaign and now being implemented by the Trump administration to not just punish the expression of speech and protest rights that are foundational to the United States, but also to intimidate and put into fear people who would express those views or just participate in debates, I find extremely disturbing.
And Glenn's right here. I mean, no one can deny free speech is a major issue, and it became so during the campaign. I mean, Biden tried to launch that Ministry of Truth joke for a while, and when that died on the eve of the election, various prominent Democrats, some of the top brass, Kerry and Hillary Clinton and AOC and Tim Walz and Kamala Harris, all said in some way that they thought that social media needed to be policed more to guard against disinformation and misinformation. So it's hard to deny that's not a big issue.
Because everything is secondary to that for me. If we don't have that right to question government dogma, to dissent from it, to explore the challenge of orthodoxies and pieties, then we're just going to be the byproduct of whatever external stimuli has been permitted. It's very, very difficult, very, very difficult in a society that is controlling and limiting what can and can't be said, what ideas can and can't be heard, to ensure that you yourself are escaping that closed system of information. It's risky, it's difficult, it's time consuming. To find it, most people aren't going to have the ability to do that. They're going to be working, taking care of their family, taking care of their kids. And it will guaranteed be a propagandized society. And a propagandized society is one that becomes conformist and acquiescent. And every other substantive policy issue from there becomes almost irrelevant.
Yeah, this is hard to deny, and we know that the three-letter agencies tried to coerce and convince the social media platforms to remove users and remove thoughts and expressions that they didn't want spread, especially when it came to the COVID regime, the Hunter Biden laptop. You know, Zuckerberg even admitted that the feds and the FBI came to him and said, hey, this is going to be a conspiracy spread, and, take safeguarding against it. So there's no denying it. You see Trump bringing it up now too, and the quest to deport people for critiquing Israel, revoke their green card for that, even if they have a wife here and a 8-month-old pregnant wife at that.
Because there's no means of actually doing anything other than quiescing to what we've been told to think. Now, on the foreign policy front, I'm obviously extremely interested in how not just this war in Ukraine is resolved, but the implications that it has for foreign policy dogma going forward. There was a forum in the Atlantic hosted by the neocon Jeffrey Goldberg, a bunch of other neocons, the types I was just describing, who think liberal democracy is the final expression of superior human expression, that U.S. foreign policy should be about imposing that, except in cases where it suits us not to, when we support dictatorships. Basically, the bipartisan foreign policy consensus that has prevailed in Washington for the last 4 or 5 decades, that President Trump 3 times ran based on the promise to undo. I don't think he was succeeded the first time. The second time he didn't win. The third time, which is now, he seems to be more devoted to that. And this idea of decades of U.S. foreign policy being upended was supposed to be alarming. I think it's very promising. This foreign policy consensus has been incredibly destructive. It's shed so much blood. It's drained away so many resources. It's justified a ubiquitous surveillance state. I think
I'm 41 years old, and it's consumed my entire life. All I've really known, except for a few years here and there, maybe in between, is perpetual war, regime change operations, foreign occupations, proxy wars. Right now we're in basically 4: Yemen, Syria, Israel, and Ukraine. Maybe even more than that. Bases around the world, military stretched too far. It has all the makings of late stage empire.
It's something that needs to be dismantled. The question is what comes in its place, but the first step is dismantling it. And so how the war in Ukraine ends up being resolved, if it is resolved, how it does, if this affects our relationship with Europe and with NATO, all of which seems to be happening, that is something that is of great interest to me as well. And I've talked about this before. I think the best quote that expressed this idea came from Seymour Hersh, who talked about the possibility of a Trump presidency, a second term, as being a, quote, circuit breaker on how Washington works. That at the very least, it will go in and break things. Things that have not been broken and nobody could have broken for many decades that probably deserve to be smashed. And so that's definitely something that I'm looking for a great deal as well.
And it's hard to deny that's not the optics. I mean, Trump has ran as that, as a disruptor. I'm going to drain the swamp. That was the 2016 mantra. I'm skeptical of that for a lot of reasons, some of which aren't really Trump's fault. There is still a powerful deep state that wields, power regardless of who's the presidential or congressional occupants. But there's something to be said that the FBI and DOJ did try to frame this man for treason. So they think it, whether or not, Trump will really prove to be a circuit breaker.
All right, Pushy Pants says, hi, Glenn. The subject has been discussed a lot this week. Why is Tucker so disdainful of Dan Crenshaw? So, obviously...
But how long do we have on this show?
This is a personality dispute. It is 2 very strong personalities who are essentially waging war against one another. Tucker has been a longtime critic of Dan Crenshaw. He's often used him as a symbol of everything wrong with the Republican Party. And it really escalated when Dan Crenshaw was caught on a hot mic when asked about Tucker, not knowing he was being recorded, saying, no, I've never met Tucker, but if I did, I would kill him. And obviously, I don't think it was a serious threat by Dan Crenshaw to want to go murder Tucker. But that's not something that you say about somebody unless you really are harboring a lot of hatred for them. Yeah, if I met him, I would kill him. And the way it was said, too, it was not joking. It was not lighthearted. It was indicative of a lot of internal hatred. And so Tucker, needless to say, escalated his war on Dan Crenshaw after hearing that, and then Dan Crenshaw has been asked about it and been replying constantly about why he dislikes Tucker. So you can dismiss it as a internet personality beef, and part of it is that, which doesn't make it uninteresting. In fact, it could be interesting just for that reason. But I think there's something much more important going on underneath, which is what a lot of American liberals and people on the left have refused to recognize for a long time, that I felt was so important, that I've been trying to focus on and talk about and see the benefits of in a way that really alienated a lot of people who were on the left, who had previously been readers or viewers or allies or whatever. But it has been clear to me for a long time that the real debates about foreign policy, about domestic policy, about the kind of country that the United States should and should not be, began to take place on the American right with the introduction of Donald Trump into Republican politics, precisely because in 2016, by necessity, since he was running against the Republican establishment, as embodied by Jeb Bush, who they all thought was the inevitable nominee, and that's where all the establishment money was, and Trump won, not just by opposing Jeb Bush, but by the entire Republican establishment ideology that had been dominant in the Republican Party going back decades, since at least Ronald Reagan, even before that.
Yeah, absolutely. If you remember from 2015, the 2015 debates, the 2016 debates, Donald Trump got up there and said to Jeb Bush, your brother's a war criminal. And people could not believe this at the time. This kind of populism had never really manifested in American politics, in kind of do good, be nice politics. And that really shocked a lot of people. So Trump really did disrupt that. Now, the same kind of battle did take place in 2012 and 2008 when Ron Paul ran, but Ron Paul was not nearly as popular. But the same divide on foreign policy was still within the ranks of Republicans in germ, but it didn't really totally come to fruition until Trump, I think.
Railing about neocons, about corporatism, about the CIA and the FBI and the security state, about endless war. You listen to Steve Bannon, who was the architect of that 2016 campaign and still has a lot of influence in the world, and he often sounds in a lot of ways like what a leftist sounds like in the 1970s or 1980s. Not coming from the same place, not with the same premises, but oftentimes with the same sensibility, the same objective, the same viewpoint. And it was clear to me that, as I just said, if the foreign policy dogma, the bipartisan dogma of the United States was going to be smashed, it was never going to be smashed by the Democratic Party. It was going to be broken by what was going on the right, particularly with this MAGA populist movement. But even though Donald Trump has obviously taken over the Republican Party as by far the most powerful figure in it, there are still huge numbers of elected officials in the Republican Party and in Trump's administration who very much hate Trump's anti-establishment views, hate his populism, are absolute advocates and loyalists to the standard Republican foreign policy that the Republican establishment has long espoused.
Yeah, it's the same ones that went to bat for Nikki Haley and Chris Christie in the primaries. It's exactly those kind.
And Republican corporatism. They hate Trump's tariffs. They hate this talk of labor unions and the working class. And they particularly hate the attempt to reorient foreign policy. They're huge supporters of the war in Ukraine, of the military-industrial complex in general. And a lot of them are too afraid to challenge Trump or to explicitly disagree with Trump because at the moment, that means you're the end of your career in the Republican Party. They look at Liz Cheney or Adam Kinzinger, people like that. And there are others, people who have been dissenters to Trump, and most of them are gone. But that doesn't mean that their ideology is aligned with Trump. A lot of them are waiting for the moment for Trump to become weakened, to become vulnerable. And all these people are lurking there.
This is so true. I think this is Glenn's best point so far. We know Trump is not going to have a third term. So in 2028, when Trump doesn't run, who's going to inherit all this right-wing energy? Right now, it's a more populist-leaning right wing. But there could be another Republican civil war that these neocons in waiting are ready to pounce on and try to retake the party. That's why I think is the only reason a lot of them haven't just solely defected to the Democrats. I mean, some social issues would split them too, but, you know, there's a lot of people that believe like this is salvageable and want to stick around for that. 2028's a long way away in terms of politics, so.
And Dan Crenshaw is such a perfect example. There are a lot in the Senate as well. People like Tom Cotton and Lindsey Graham. But Dan Crenshaw, and I say this in his defense, I guess, is he has a very high opinion of himself. He was injured in combat. He has, I believe, advanced degrees from Harvard or Yale. I mean, his curriculum is sterling, and he knows that, and he's very impressed with himself. And so he's less willing to pretend or to sacrifice his dignity than most other Republican politicians. He is willing to. I've heard him try to claim that Trump's views on Ukraine are his views, even though it's so preposterous, so that he doesn't have to criticize Trump. But he is just a little bit more candid about what he really thinks, and especially in terms of what he really thinks, his belief in Bush, Cheney, Republican establishment, John McCain, Lindsey Graham.
Glenn's a nicer man than me because I'm just going to say it. This is Eye Patch McCain. Glenn is way too charitable on Dan Crenshaw, and that's Glenn's disposition, and I appreciate that. But he's basically supported all the wars, all the surveillance state, all the deep state, every CIA narrative you can possibly think of, he's on board with it.
Type of foreign policy that is also very much the Democratic foreign policy as well. And Tucker could see that from the beginning and knew that Dan Crenshaw was the kind of Republican that, in Tucker's view, would sabotage the Trump agenda and that needed to be purged from the Republican Party. And so he often used Dan Crenshaw, and I think in part because Dan Crenshaw sort of became a very popular figure for a while. He was somebody Republicans, including MAGA, really liked. You know, on the surface, what's not to like about him? He's a good-looking guy. He has this impressive combat record. He is.
Glenn is pretty charitable to Crenshaw. I'm actually a little surprised at this.
The eye patch. He speaks well. He understands social media. I think he has like several million followers on Instagram. So he seemed like kind of potential future conservative leader. So a lot of people were enamored of him. And I think that was one of the reasons why Tucker wanted to alert people to the fact that, no, he actually has this ideology that is very archaic, that is not in any way whatever you might think of the America First or MAGA ideology. And this, I think, is one of the things that's most misunderstood, especially by people on the left and American liberals, is these divisions inside the American right are vituperative. They're not just questions of style or degree, the way that the debates mostly are on, within the Democratic Party. Like the AOC and Bernie wing, you have some disagreements with the kind of Pelosi, Obama, Biden wing, but they're not very fundamental. They're not very ideological. There's questions of degree and style.
Yeah, I agree with this. The left has become more galvanized in recent years. They weren't under the civil war of the 2016 election, that's for sure. But now they mostly are. Even the Squad seems on board with funding, you know, most of the war machine, most of the Ukraine aid, like almost all the things that the Democratic establishment wants. The Squad is pretty aligned with.
Whereas the real debates are taking place in the Republican Party, and I think that the question of whether the Republican Party will revert back to what it was before Trump is very much the concern of a lot of people who want Trump's ideology to prevail and not, say, Mitch McConnell's or John McCain's or Dan Crenshaw's. And so I thought, and remember as well that when Tucker got fired from Fox, and he got fired for ideological reasons. I mean, his show was as successful as you could hope it was. They never really recovered. I mean, Jesse Waters has very good ratings, more than I think anybody else in cable news, certainly. But they're
Yeah, you can tell that to anyone that says, you know, the sole purpose of the corporate media Goliaths is to make money. It's clearly not just that, otherwise Tucker would still be there. He did monster ratings. They also want to ram an agenda down your throat. And it doesn't matter if it's CNN or Fox or MSNBC, they all want to do that to some degree and in some direction.
Not at the level that Tucker's was. He doesn't have the following, that intense following that Tucker had. And you see now Tucker's podcast is one of the top 4 or 5 most popular podcasts in the country. His gigantic following, huge amounts of influence. When Tucker was fired from Fox News, there were all sorts of Republicans, none of them willing to put their names on it, but at the time anonymously running to Politico and Axios saying how happy they are that Tucker's no longer on the air because that will make their lives so much easier, especially on things like funding foreign wars like in Ukraine. And now a lot of them are just willing to attack Tucker all the time. Now that he's been labeled an anti-Semite and all of that, and an isolationist, a Russian propagandist.
Oh yeah,
they feel like
course.
They've sufficiently marginalized him or demonized him where they feel more comfortable to attack him. And this dispute between Tucker on the one hand and Crenshaw on the other is interesting in and of itself, is entertaining, but it has that importance that it really shows what these ideological divisions are still in the American right. And Trump in a few years won't be the standard bearer of the Republican Party, and there's going to be a massive war to ensure that the Republican Party becomes essentially the mirror image of the Democratic Party, so that Americans don't really have a choice on the issues that power centers care most about.
That's so true, and I personally hope that Vivek Ramaswamy is the one that inherits that populist right energy, because I think he's more aligned with my views than the others. Of course, I don't agree with him on everything either, but I'd much rather be having him steer the ship rather than J.D. Vance or, Crenshaw. And Tucker goes after other neocons, too. He's actually infamous for it. He attacks a lot of neocons. But Dan Crenshaw is, he's a prototypical archetypal one, so that's probably the biggest reason.
That's why they wanted Jeb Bush. Imagine Jeb Bush versus Hillary Clinton. Who cares? It's the same exact factions being served in exactly the same way. And that's what Ron DeSantis was for, by the way, as well, to stop Trump, to give this kind of feel of anti-establishment pop. But Ron DeSantis was there, and if you look at who was behind him and what money was behind him, you will see that it was largely people who believe in the kind of foreign policy that Trump rejects, at least ostensibly. And that is the most important thing to power centers in the United States, is that neither the Democratic Party nor the Republican Party adopt an ideology that truly challenges their interests. And for all the reasons I was just saying, Trump is promising in the sense that he can break things. He's a circuit breaker, as Seymour Hersh put it. That's the same reason that he's feared and despised by so many people who had control of the Republican Party and want to remake it in the image of the old Republican Party, which is basically a mirror image of the Democratic Party, so that Americans, nothing really changes no matter who you vote for.
That's a great point. That's such an understatement. That is the uniparty in a nutshell. Glenn just described it. That's what they want. That's what some of these lingering, Republican establishment figures want to do in 2028.
Some social issues are different.
Yeah, that's the biggest
ancillary
divide.
things are different, but the foundational distribution of power and how things are organized remains the same, and Trump is a threat to that, which is why The Atlantic held a forum today saying Trump is, quote, upending decades of foreign policy. They wouldn't say that about anybody else. So I've always been interested in these splits in the American right. It's part of what I think is most interesting and promising and exciting about American politics. I've seen people try to foster these debates inside the Democratic Party for a long time, and it always ends up failing for institutional and structural reasons. So this to me is the thing that I still think, in terms of what the Trump administration, his second term is going to be, is going to become, is one of the things that is most important.
So for someone that comes from kind of the civil rights oriented left, Glenn Greenwald really understands the American right better than almost anyone, as far as I'm concerned. His points here were so good. It's really going to be interesting to see what develops in 2028. And, I think it's kind of an open race. I mean, the Republican base and Trump supporters really seem to like JD Vance, and I can't deny he presents extremely well. I personally don't like his policy positions on almost anything. Remember the first time that he kind of got prestige, like right as he was nominated as the vice presidential candidate, he implored the RNC in his first major interview that we have to bomb Iran. And that was extremely concerning. He's also probably more of an ideological kind of protectionist than Trump himself. So I'm not a big fan of Vance, but I have to give him due. He is very good at presenting. We saw this on the Rogan interview. He's really good at kind of touching people in terms of their emotions, really relating to people and talking to people. So he's a dangerous force, don't get me wrong. But I want to hear from you guys. What do you think is the most major divide in the Republican Party and the American right today? Let me know in the comments below. And also, how do you see things shaping up in 2028? Who will be the Republican presidential nominee? I want to hear from you. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel. And as we always say, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, no more empire. All right, peace out. I'll see you guys in the next one.